I experienced this story, and my best friend and I have only shared it with a few people. Edwin Shaw Memorial Hospital can be found in Lakemore, Ohio. Edwin Shaw Hospital was closed in 2010. All functions stopped within, so the building was promptly shut down and abandoned. My best friend and I are urban explorers. We like to find old, abandoned buildings and explore them. This story has inspired us to continue exploring, but we now take cameras for proof. One day, in the middle of June 2016, my best friend Chase picked me up and told me he had something to show me. It turned out that Chase had heard of Edwin Shaw Memorial Hospital, and he wanted to take me there to explore it. Edwin Shaw sits about 30 minutes away from my house, and the main buildings sit farther back from the property. Chase and I parked our car at a golf course nearby and began to sneak our way onto the property. We got to the main building completely fine, but there was tall grass everywhere. We dodged our way around piles of trash and debris and made our way inside. As soon as we entered the building, the first thing that was noticeable was the temperature change. Although the building had been closed for 6 long years, it still felt as if the building was being air-conditioned heavily. We welcomed the cool air and continued on into the hospital. As we entered the building, we found a staircase in front of us, one leading up and one leading down, a front lobby area to our left, and hospital rooms to our right. My friend and I, without hesitation, walked quickly through the doorway to our right and entered the darkness. The first thing I noticed in the hallway of the hospital was the graffiti. There was graffiti with a simple black spray paint can over every single inch of the entire hallway. There were messages written, hearts drawn, and even warnings to leave while you still could. We continued on because graffiti is something we've experienced at many other abandoned places. As we continued to walk, we quickly started to realize the incredible amounts of broken glass on the floor. The crunch of the broken glass under my tennis shoes was so loud I could barely think. As we continued walking, I started looking down to reassure myself of my steps, and then I saw it. All the way down the hallway was a trail of what looked like blood. I want to clarify that it wasn't as if someone had dragged a body down the hallway. It was as if someone had cut themselves very badly and had been running down the hallway while it dripped profusely. Chase and I noticed the blood almost exactly at the same time, and we both stopped in the middle of the hallway. We stood there listening for what felt like hours, though it had only been a few moments. It was still very dark, so we weren't sure if the trail we saw was indeed blood. Upon further investigation with a phone light, we confirmed that the trail down the hallway was blood. We turned around and looked down the hallway that we had been walking down, and we began to investigate the blood trail. The blood trail led all the way down the hallway to the last room on the left. The door was closed. Chase and I decided to open the door and determine what had happened. As we opened the old, rusty door, a very loud, whiny creak echoed through the empty hospital. The trail of blood led directly to a floor-to-ceiling window that was entirely shattered. The bottom of the window was only about 3 feet higher than the dirt on the ground outside, but the window had obviously been shattered outwards, and shards of glass littered the ground. It was clear to Chase and me that the person who had been cut hadn't been harmed by anything in the room, so we turned back into the hallway and followed the blood trail the other way. I don't know if any of you reading this have ever had the pleasure of exploring an abandoned hospital, but I must highlight the fact that abandoned hospitals are very creepy. As we walked back out into the hallway, we turned our phone lights on and began to walk the other way, still following the blood trail. The blood led all the way down to the end of the hallway and made a left in the last doorway. As Chase and I approached the doorway, we heard dripping water echoing in the distance. As we turned left into the doorway, we discovered that it was the doorway to stairs leading downwards. We were already on ground level, so these were the stairs to the basement. The blood trail was very clearly defined all the way down the stairs and into the pitch black of the basement. Chase and I stood there for a few minutes deciding whether or not we should follow this blood trail. We love exploring, but we were always very concerned about our personal well-being. After some heated discussion, Chase convinced me to enter the basement. We had no official flashlights except for the ones on our phones. We had no camera to record what we were doing, and we had no way to defend ourselves. Against my better judgment, we entered the basement. The first thing I noticed was the cold and the humidity. Within seconds of being in the basement, my shirt clung tightly to my figure because of the humidity, and beads of sweat formed on my forehead despite the cold. We continued on, Chase in the lead. The basement looked just like the hospital above us, only the slight change in temperature and sound because we were underground. After following the blood trail through a few doors, we found that the basement was not like other basements. The ceiling was low, and there was a small door fashioned in the concrete in front of us. The door was old and white, and had the orange tint of rust that was inevitably settling in because of the constant humidity. As we opened the door to the bottom of the stairs, there was a sharp blast of wind that came ripping through the open doorway. It carried the musty scent of a moldy, nasty tunnel. With the flashlights on our phones, we could see the blood trail leading down the tunnel. We kept on walking, constantly checking in front and behind of us for anything amiss. After walking for about a minute, we heard subtle noises coming towards us from down the tunnel a ways. As we continued, we approached a propped open door in the middle of the tunnel. The trail of blood seemed to come from the propped open door. As we got closer to the door, the stench hit us. It was the worst smell I've ever smelled. It smelled like rotting meat mixed with the musty smell of the tunnel. Chase and I looked at one another and simultaneously walked through the open door. What we found inside, I can only describe as horror. The room had a low ceiling and no light at all. With the lights of the flashlights, we could tell that the room was entirely empty aside from debris on the floor, and it was big enough to fit 25 people comfortably. As our flashlights hit the floor, we realized that the debris on the floor was not debris. Scattered all over the floor was the carcasses of animals. It looked as if though they had been ripped to shreds. Squirrels, cats, dogs, and what looked like a deer. Every one of the carcasses sat in a uniform position. Taking a closer look, it was a pentagram on the ground, and each carcass of an animal marked one of the star points on the pentagram. The smell was unbearable, and the air was ice cold. There was so much blood on the ground. In the center of the pentagram, there was a piece of paper with scribbling on it. Chase and I realized what lay on the floor in front of us, and we both bolted. I've never run faster in my life. We got out of the building, back into the heat of the summer, but that didn't stop us. We sprinted all the way back to the car and sped out of there. The only reason that I wanted to share this story is that I recently saw in the local news that Edwin Shaw Memorial Hospital started destruction December 1st, 2016. I encourage you to research this place. You can find plenty of information, pictures, and videos. But for myself, I will never return to Edwin Shaw Memorial Hospital and that haunting place.
Last summer, after an accident, I found myself in the hospital in need of surgery. I had a ruptured bladder, among other things, which is about as pleasant as it sounds. My parents and girlfriend were on vacation on opposite sides of the world, and I called them to let them know what was up and that, no, I wasn't going to die, and no, I didn't want them to return home early for me. I was a big boy after all. So, when I woke up after they'd finished up on me, it was just me, my hospital room, and the tubes coming out of various parts of my body. I was told I'd be confined to my bed for the first 3 days to give the stitches a chance to settle. I use the word stitches lightly. I was being held together by staples, like literal, actual staples, all the way down from my belly button. Gee, what a sight to wake up to. The doctor came to see me shortly after, and I bombarded him with questions about my surgery, how it had gone, and what my outlook was. Most importantly, I wanted to know if my bladder was going to recover, or if I'd end up prematurely incontinent and with a catheter at age 23. Being a doctor, of course, and wanting to, not get sued, he was frustratingly vague in his answers, until I'd worked myself up so much that he called in a nurse to offer me some anti-anxiety stuff. The nurse was pretty cool. We'd bonded over the fact that we were both vegan, as he wheeled me down to the theatre in the morning. He told me to look forward to so much soy pudding and instant soup that I'd never want to smell or eat either again, as I wouldn't be allowed solid foods for several days after the procedure. Now he was at my bedside, looking concerned. I was clearly in distress and pissed off, pun intended, over my uncertain future. He told me that, between the two of us, while he respected the doctor's advice, he had mixed feelings over administering anxiety meds in the evening, as numerous patients had reported having trouble getting a good night's sleep as it mixed with the painkillers they were administering via IV. I figured a chill pill plus painkillers would only help me sleep better, and, ignoring his friendly advice, asked to have it. He shrugged and wished me a good night, turning the light off as he left. Now, as I said, this all happened last summer, and I was lucky enough to have a room to myself, as the place I was at specialized in the kind of urology procedures you usually plan ahead, and not a lot of people choose to have surgery while it's hot as balls. Now, I don't know if you've ever taken any kind of anxiety medication, but let me just say, 20 minutes later, I couldn't have cared less whether or not I was ever going to pee freely again. I watched TV for a bit before drifting off into a hazy sleep. Waking up was weird. It was as though I'd been awake and my eyes open for a while before I actually realized I wasn't sleeping anymore. The room was dark, save for the light just by the door that was triggered by a motion sensor. The night nurse must have opened the door just to peek in and make sure I was okay, and then left, not wanting to wake me. Well, thanks, I thought. Now I am awake. While the painkiller was still dripping slowly and steadily into me, it felt like the pills must have worn off. At least, I no longer felt the least bit chill. I couldn't have said what it was, but as my fogged mind continued to clear itself of the remnants of sleep, I became more and more convinced that I was not quite alone. I was inexplicably certain that, just as the nurse had closed the door, something from the corridor outside had slipped past him unnoticed and was now hiding in my bathroom. The bathroom connected my room with the next, but as far as I was aware, the door on the other side was closed. Mine, however, was slightly ajar. I peered at it quickly and then looked away. There was only blackness. I tried to force myself to breathe evenly, remembering what the nurse had said. I was pretty certain I was hallucinating, most likely thanks to the unfortunate cocktail of pills and IV fluids in my system. I don't know if you've ever hallucinated, but knowing you're hallucinating doesn't really make it any less scary, because obviously you're telling yourself, hey, any awful thing you imagine right now might just pop into existence right by your bedside, so don't think of anything scary. But quick, don't think of kangaroos now. You see what I mean? After a few minutes of me just staring at the darkness overhead, I heard her. I say her because I knew with a weird certainty that it was only her, even though the voices were many. She was singing, or rather, chanting, just behind the bathroom door. It was really quite beautiful, like a chorus of mermaids or forest fairies maybe, or maybe priestesses of a foreign cult. I couldn't make out the words, but it was as if the song manifested itself in my mind like a faint blue glow. Sounds weird, right? I don't know how else to explain it. Needless to say, I would have still pissed myself if I could have. At this point, I was earnestly considering calling the nurse. But what was I going to tell him? You were right, I shouldn't have taken that pill, and now I think a banshee is hiding in my bathroom. No. I may have been wearing a ridiculous gown and peeing into 2 different bags, but I did have some dignity left. I decided instead to text my girlfriend. It was only early evening where she was, so she was quick to respond to my charming opener of, "I miss you and, by the way, I think there's a ghost woman singing in my bathroom." We exchanged a few corny texts. She tried to distract me with a funny cat video that wouldn't load with my shitty internet connection, and I tried to snap a selfie for her. That's when I dropped my phone. It clattered to the floor beside my bed, and, abruptly, the singing stopped. I can't explain why, but I was immediately filled with a nameless, gut-wrenching dread and sense of doom like I've never felt before. Doing what any sensible person would do, I covered my face with my hands and clenched my eyes shut, trembling in the darkness. A moment later I felt something like an icy breeze on my hands, and what parts of my face they didn't cover. It sounded like a breath. I held as still as I could. I would have run if I could, but that would have meant ripping out several tubes that were firmly lodged inside me. I felt the breath on my face, in and out, in and out. I think it was waiting for me to mess up. My phone on the floor vibrated once, then twice. Incoming text messages from my girlfriend, who was probably wondering where I'd gone. I held still. I knew that if I opened my eyes or made a sound, I would be in trouble. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I felt the presence withdraw from me. Shortly after, the singing resumed. I must have passed out. I woke again perhaps an hour later to footsteps thundering down the corridor outside, an alarm going off somewhere, and voices from my bathroom. No, I realized as I blinked the sleep from my eyes once more. No sounds from the bathroom. It must have been my neighbor's room adjacent to it. How could this have happened? I don't know. I checked in on her 40 minutes ago. I thought she was sleeping. It's not like she was unstable. I just don't know. I lay there listening to the pair next door discuss what could only mean the death of my neighbor. And all I could think about was how grateful I was to hear people nearby, assuring me that I wasn't trapped alone with some demon. I had the weird feeling that this meant I'd gotten off lucky. I drifted back to sleep before the noise had died down. When I asked about last night's racket the next day, the nurse looked uncomfortable, as if weighing how much information he could or couldn't give me about another patient. I quickly shook my head, dismissing the subject. "You know," I said, trying to lighten up the situation as he turned and walked towards the door, "I could have sworn I heard some sort of white lady chanting last night. I thought she was coming for me." "You were right about that pill." I may have been imagining things, but I could swear he froze for half a second before chuckling and heading out. I lost my single-room privileges that afternoon, as a bunch of new arrivals meant they had to relocate several patients. When the nurse came to get me, I was about to complain and ask about the room next door that had clearly been vacated just last night. but then swallowed the question as insensitive and complied. I'm pleased to say I made a full recovery and stayed off the anxiety meds on subsequent nights. The two guys I was roomed with were unpleasant and loud, but at least their continuous blabbing and nightly complaints about aches and pains kept whatever ghost may have been lurking away. Ever since I left the hospital, I've been telling the story of the ghost woman in my bathroom any chance I get. I've never truly believed in the paranormal and supernatural, but sometimes when I tell that story, someone pauses for just half a second too long before they laugh and shrug it off, and I've never had the courage to ask why.
I don't really have a clear reason for writing this. This isn't a warning. The hospital's been shut down for over 10 years. I suppose this is to serve a moral right. Not that this erases my past sins, but I feel that if I really want to make up for those wrongs, for the pain I have caused, the least I could do is confess, apologize. Before I begin, I want to unequivocally emphasize that none of what you read here is standard procedure for surgeons, doctors, or anesthesiologists. The vast majority of medical professionals are truly devoted to helping the sick, the injured, and very few are as corrupt or amoral as I once was, or as the staff of the Phil Offmill Medical Center was once, before the operation was shut down. I cannot emphasize this enough. Do not let the story scare you away from a medical procedure or taint your perception of anesthesiologists. My account concerns only the exploits of a no longer existing small medical center in Detroit, not the secrets of the entire medical profession. I have done the anesthesiologist community a great disservice by damaging their reputation, and for that I am sincerely sorry, as I am to the patients whom I have caused to suffer. As far as I know, this is the first time that the secret of the Phil Offmill Medical Center has been revealed to the world. The hospital doesn't even show up on an internet search, a tribute to either its relative obscurity or to the effectiveness of the cover-up that followed its closure. Let me begin at the beginning. The Phil Offmill Medical Center was a small medical facility, largely specializing in outpatient surgical operations, located in a relatively downtrodden area of Detroit. The essence of this hospital was saving money. The founder, Dr. Phil Offman, chose the cheapest land in the city of Detroit to build the center in the summer of 1997. He renovated it from a previously abandoned building, and how he managed to evade government inspectors with faulty wiring, failure to comply with fire codes, and the use of medical staff that may not have been fully licensed, I have no idea. He was good at stuff like that, evading the pursuits of licensing boards and government regulators, ensuring that patients wouldn't start lawsuits. He always got equipment and drugs from the cheapest suppliers, and sometimes of questionable legality. But the services were cheap, and we received many people from the greater Detroit area, especially those who were uninsured and could only afford our services. I was a licensed anesthesiologist back in 1999, but the job market was tight, and a few medical centers or facilities had need for my services. That's when Dr. Offmill contacted me. He offered me a job, mediocre pay for the industry, but who was I to refuse? As soon as I started working at the facility, I encountered Offmill's devotion to cutting costs. Cheap equipment, poor maintenance, shoddy surgeries. How we never got sued, I have no idea. Perhaps our patient base didn't have the financial faculties to hire lawyers, and, besides, Offmill must have had ways to ensure that victims of poor or botched medical care never came after him. Like he had ways to deter inspectors. But that's besides the point. The hospital was finally shut down in 2004 after a series of particularly bad incidents, including patient testimonials of botched surgeries that appeared in a local newspaper, as well as a fire caused by faulty wiring. This finally brought the authorities down upon us, and even Off-Mill couldn't prevent the inevitable closure. I was recently interested in rediscovering those old newspaper clippings or records of the closure, but try as I might, I couldn't find them. As if the media record were cleared. After all, the botched spinal surgery, the cockroach infestation, the Legionnaire's disease, the failure to comply with fire codes, all of the issues that brought the authorities descending on the hospital, that was just the tip of the iceberg. The true horror, the horror that could have panicked the public, the horror that convinced the Detroit government to cover the whole affair to prevent paranoia and anxiety about all hospitals, that was far worse. That's what I finally want to reveal today. I don't want this to ruin the reputation of all anesthesiologists. I only want this to reflect on myself. The events leading up to the horror began in March 2002. Our supplier of sevoflurane had raised prices 35% due to a shortage of a particular technological component they needed in the facilities manufacturing the compound. For those of you unfamiliar with the terminology, sevoflurane is a widely used anesthetic, and for us was essentially the only anesthetic we used. Dr. Off-Mill called the staff into his office, describing the situation as a crisis. He was trying to cut costs everywhere to maximize profits while keeping the care relatively inexpensive, and the increase in the sevoflurane price would significantly impact our operations. Anyway, he had already paid a significant tip, his euphemism for a bribe, to a building inspector, and he couldn't afford to shoulder the additional price for the month. I don't know if it's true that he really couldn't afford the increased anesthetic price, or if he merely was trying to increase profit margins. He did get most of the profits, after all. Then, he told us his plan. Medical procedures are outdated and overexpensive, he told us. Do we really need to pay for those expensive anesthetic compounds? Or is there a better way, an alternative to sevoflurane? If we master this new technique, he told me, not only would we be able to procure the cheapest surgeries for the highest profit, but, if successful, we would become rich and famous, inventors of a revolutionary new type of procedure. The idea was simple. I don't know why I didn't object to it. I was too protective of keeping my job. Anyway, I had some idea of what Dr. Off-Mill did to the members of the staff who tried to leave, and especially those would-be whistleblowers, leading to some of us to call the hospital the cult of Off-Mill behind his back, of course. The entire idea of anesthesia was outdated, he explained. Sedate a patient so he doesn't feel any pain, so he typically, for the procedures we performed, wasn't even conscious, and wake him up afterwards. That was the standard, and he told us it was unnecessary. If we performed a new technique, we didn't need expensive sevoflurane. Let's try amnesia instead of anesthesia, he told me. Drug-induced amnesia. Restrain a patient with physical restraints or a paralytic agent during surgery, he explained, then wipe their memory afterwards. Do the effects of pain even matter, he asked, if the patient forgets the experience? Drug-induced amnesia. Supply benzodiazepines afterwards so they forget the procedure. Simple, effective, brilliant, and above all, cheap. Of course, we didn't tell the patients about this before their surgery. If we could afford a paralytic, we used that to restrain them, or else physical restraints. Then supply the amnesia-inducing agent using a cocktail of benzodiazepines or other compounds. Rinse and repeat. They experienced all the pains of surgery, then forgot. 18th century medicine plus amnesia. Hundreds of patients, hundreds of operations. During the investigation in 2004, the truth emerged. The city government realized the effects if this story were released. Panic, fear, paranoia, disgust, outrage, horror. They quietly shut down the hospital, dispelled the media, and the whole affair made 10th-page news in some of the local papers. I don't know what became of Dr. Offmill or of the rest of the staff. The building is still abandoned in the city. Most of the equipment and the blood-stained surgical table has been seized by the government, though. I suppose that's all I have to confess.
Let me first start off by saying that, on behalf of my dying father and the rest of our family, we are sorry. We're sorry for not handling things differently and possibly putting all your lives in danger. Let me start from the beginning. My dad and I had just finished Thanksgiving dinner last afternoon, at around 2 p.m. All the family left and my sister and mother went out shopping. So, my dad and I, alone in the house, decided to start getting the Christmas decorations in motion, in hopes that we could be done with them by the end of the week. We marched up to the 3rd floor of our house and over to the attic opening. My dad walked up the ladder and began to hand me down some boxes. After about 2 minutes of moving boxes, I hear my dad say, "What the?" Then I hear a blood-curdling scream. I climbed up the ladder as quickly as possible and saw a huge rat scurry into the darkness. Now, when I say huge, I mean like 2 feet long and about 8 or 9 inches tall. This thing was the size of a dog. I know it was a rat, though. I've handled rats before, and I know one when I see it. It was a rat, just a really big one. I turned over, visibly shaken because of what I'd just seen, and my father, who was clutching at his forearm with blood spewing everywhere. I hurried over to him and helped him down the stairs, being careful not to touch any blood. My initial thought was rabies, and that disease isn't transmitted via blood, but something about that rat made me more cautious of helping my father. He told me to walk him to the bathroom so he could clean the wound. I brought him over some alcohol and some cotton swabs, while notifying him how much this was about to hurt. He said he knew, and I asked, "Are you sure we shouldn't go to the hospital?" He assured me it was okay, and decided to apply the alcohol himself. The scream he let out was worse than when he had gotten bit. He suffered through it, though, and draped his unbitten arm over my shoulder as I helped him hobble to his bed. It didn't take more than a minute for him to pass out on that mattress. I was still in the room, just staring at him, and trying to grasp what had just happened. Less than an hour ago, we were all eating gravy-covered turkey and laughing about old memories with one another. And now, I'd just helped my father limp to his bed. It was surreal, really, the amount of blood at the scene. I knew he should have gone to the hospital, so when he fell asleep, I called Mum and told her about the situation. She said she would head home immediately and take care of it. 20 minutes later, I heard the front door slam open as my frantic mother ran up the stairs. I had a real problem dealing with looking at that blood for so long, so I just sat outside and waited for her to come home. When she finally arrived, we walked in together to check on my father, and in that 20-minute time period, he went from looking like he got badly cut by a kitchen knife to an Ebola patient. Now, I don't use that analogy loosely. He actually looked like he was very near death. White bumps all over his face, motionless body. I was horrified. My mother helped me walk him to the car, and as a family, we all drove to the hospital. About an hour had passed since the initial bite, and the hospital was now in sight. Then, we began to hear a moaning sound from my father in the back seat. My sister leaned over to see what he was trying to say, and just like in those horror movies, he bit her on the neck. Only, this bite was different than what you see in the movies. This was much more vicious. Half of my sister's neck departed with that fatal bite, and immediately she fell to the bottom of the car, motionless. My mother screamed as I sat silent in shock, and she swerved into the hospital parking lot. She slammed on the brakes and we both ran out towards the entrance. Some hospital staff ran out to meet us and ask us what all the commotion was about. My mother tried to explain to them the situation, but she couldn't get it out between her vicious tears. I was still in shock, but I was able to tell them that the people who needed help were in the car, and that my father had gotten bitten by a rat. Moments later, about 5 doctors ran out to the car and pulled my father and sister in on a stretcher. My mother and I both received medical attention because of the trauma we'd just experienced. And while we were being checked out on the first floor, we saw 2 SWAT cars pull up to the hospital. They ran in a unified line to the elevator, and more cops, SWAT, and even CDC cars pulled up to secure the perimeter of the hospital. My mother eventually went to the 5th floor, where my father and sister were, to check on them, while I was still on the 1st floor. About 20 minutes ago, they drilled every exit of the building completely shut, and now have guns pointed at the windows. They said anyone who tries to escape would be fired upon. I tried to get to the 5th floor, but the elevator was shut down. I began to frantically ask every doctor I could find about the situation, and no one had any clue what was happening. Eventually, I found a doctor being looked at by other doctors on the 1st floor. I recognized him because he was one of the doctors that had run out to the car when we first arrived. He looked exactly like my father did when my mother and I checked on him. I tried to knock on the door and ask the nurses to let me talk to the doctor, but they just shut the blinds and shooed me away. I'm worried for my family, and I'm worried for the 40 or so innocent people who were in the lobby with me when they locked the doors. I'm worried for the medical staff at the hospital, and I'm worried that whatever my dad caught from that rat might spread to the outside world. We've been in this hospital for a day now, and still no word. Last night we heard a ton of screaming from the room where the doctor was being looked at, but no one can see anything because the blinds are still closed. I'll try to update soon. Hopefully.
I am in need of some serious help. Please hear me out. This is going to sound crazy. It's going to sound ridiculous. I know that what's happening to me is wrong. I don't know what to do or how to solve whatever mess I've landed myself in. All I'm asking for is your advice and your attention. Someone needs to know what's happening to me here. I just want to start off by saying, I am not battling any kind of mental disorders. I have been perfectly fine all my life. Apart from a few stressful moments, I've never experienced major anxiety or depression. So, you might be able to empathize with the confusion I felt when I woke up all alone in a mental hospital. Dressed in all white, stiff cardboard-like clothing with no shoes on, I tried to fight back the panic when I was able to open my eyes. I was dizzy and groggy. My mind was still fuzzy. I have no memory of the last moments before passing out or falling asleep, or whatever the fuck happened. All I know is that I didn't come here on my own personal will. I inspected the room, trying to figure out where the hell I was. The room was windowless, built in a thick white brick. Fluorescent lights lit the room in a disgusting sterile color. There was a desk. It was small and wooden. On top was a tiny cup with colorful pills in them, a sticky note telling me to take them as soon as I could. My bed was tiny, twin-sized, and new folded sheets and a pillowcase were laid across the end. I didn't take those pills. I counted the seconds as they turned into minutes, waiting for a nurse to come to my room. At first, I figured there had been some kind of mix-up, that I was mistakenly checked in, that they meant to bring in someone else. When she finally came in, guys, there was something off about her. Her uniform was cheaply made, like it was a costume. She had full face makeup on, and the way she spoke reminded me of a game show host. "I think I've been brought here by mistake," I'd inform her, which she easily replied, never looking up from her clipboard. "No mistake, sir. I'm not mentally ill or unstable. There's no reason I should be in here," I plead, my chest beginning to tighten. "There's a reason for everything, sir." She smiled at me, every movement she had being so theatrical and exaggerated. It bothered me to my very core. I noticed despite her writing on the clipboard, there were no words, just an empty piece of paper, like she was just pretending to write. I tried to plead with her, to no avail. She locked the door after entering, so I couldn't make a run for it. "Breakfast is at 8, lunch is at noon, dinner is at 5. You are expected to take all medications given to you, sir, no exceptions. You'll be allowed 1 hour of time outside, accompanied by a staff member, of course. There is a panic button right by the door. We'll be checking on you often, but ring if there are any emergencies." You're not understanding me. I don't belong here. I don't know what's happening. I need to make a phone call. Can you take me to... "Enjoy your treatment here at Kramer Mental Institution," she interrupted, fake smile never wavering, the plasticky fabric of her uniform squeaking as she walked out. On my desk, she flipped the cover of a small book on a stand. The first page in red lettering said this: Day 1. I don't know how, but I still have my cell phone. I'm unable to make any calls, and all my contacts are synced with the wrong numbers. I knew my mother's number by heart, and that wasn't it anymore. I am blocked from viewing all social media. I don't think they know what Reddit is, and I'm glad they don't. Guys, I'm freaking out right now. The door is bolted shut from the outside. I haven't heard anyone pass by the hallway in hours, and the panic button does nothing. No one responds. What's even worse, the Kramer Mental Institution has been shut down since the 90s. The whole building has been remodeled into a hotel or some shit. I don't even know where I am, know what to do, and you are the only outside source of contact I have. Please help me. I'll try and update soon and keep my phone close to me at all times. I'm not sure what's going to happen to me, and I'm terrified. I hope to talk with you guys soon.
I've been working nights for a couple of years now, handling supplies and other odd jobs around a rural hospital. My job title has kind of bounced back and forth over the past few months, but I can get into that another time if anyone's interested. Keep in mind, this is only one incident, and I've noticed some common occurrences. I'm known to be one of the more enthusiastic employees in my department, thanks to my determination to solve a good mystery. Typically those come in the form of figuring out what random item a stressed out nurse calls down for. On a slow night though, the floors don't need much aside from what's already stocked and readily available. And when the nurses aren't doing anything, I'm not doing anything, and my motivation for the night fades pretty fast. The slowest night of the year is always hands down Christmas Eve. Most people aren't working, so they aren't catching the flu or cutting themselves. And I'm not sure if it's due to restricted alcohol sales around here for the holiday, or even the Christmas spirit itself, but we barely see any car accidents. All in all, it's 8 long hours spent watching videos buffer on the crappy Wi-Fi and trying not to fall asleep next to the normally busy phone. On this particular night though, I fell asleep for about 45 minutes before I was startled by a heavy knock on the door. The storeroom was with limited access to most employee badges. Aside from our department and security, You had to find someone to let you in. So, a visitor pounding on the door at 2 a.m. wasn't much of a surprise. The previous week I encountered something strange on the pediatric floor, though I was easily shaken. It was just Carl, though, right on schedule, to throw on some scrubs, to go into the clean room to mop the floor. It was a pain in the ass to suit up every time someone needed something in there, but a necessary evil to prevent contamination of the surgical supplies. Carl taught my ear off, an unusually welcomed conversation thanks to the circumstances of that night. He rambled on about paying child support and his daughter's newly formed makeup addiction. As delighted as I was for the company, the charm wore off quickly. That was when the storeroom door flew open with a heavy crash. I was used to the old door, but it nearly made Carl jump out of his skin. Jacob was security and liked to make his presence known. He was a burly guy, a few years older than me, that liked to party and loved being looked up to like a giant. The two of us got along pretty well, crossing paths regularly throughout most of the night. He'd tell me about all the weirdos he got to babysit in ER, and I got to tell him about the rude phone calls I got demanding supplies. Together, we chuckled the shift away. That night there were no stories to tell, and I couldn't bear another second with Carl, so I joined Jake on his patrol. Although this may sound exciting, it basically just involved him barging into every department to try his luck on anything without a Y chromosome. As we walked the halls giggling and racing on old linen carts like scooters, Jake paused to check his radio. He was needed immediately in the emergency room. Now normally, I'd mind my own business, but I was bored and Jake pressured me into coming with him. My bosses were never on the third shift, so I basically reported to myself all night without consequence anyways. The ER was barren aside from one nurse and one doctor. Only half of the area was lit due to the low patient volume, and the hallway from the ambulance entrance was pitch black. The two of us made our way into the darkness as Jake bounced up and down, clapping his hands to try and make the lights come on. As per usual, they didn't. When we finally got to the entrance, 2 EMTs rushed through the door with an old man strapped to the stretcher. Their white shirts were stained red as they fumbled with new pairs of blue gloves. Medical staff immediately wheeled the man into triage, haphazardly pulling the tall curtains shut. I stared at the lower edge of the curtain, watching frantic feet rush back and forth. Something fell to the ground, and I could faintly hear the doctor yell at the nurse to pick it up. I couldn't see much detail, but it definitely looked like a finger from my angle. Although the scene was intriguing, my attention became focused down the hall as I saw Jake trying to calm a hysterical woman. The frail older woman clung to Jake as he tried to pull her to her feet over and over. Eventually, Jake managed to calm her down and call for assistance. I wanted to watch the excitement, but the nurse began screaming for a crash cart. I sprinted down the hall to the red cart, unlocked the wheels, and made my way to triage. I frantically plugged in the defibrillator, and the rest was out of my hands. After 10 minutes, the doctor walked past me without saying a word. I could hear the nurse cleaning blood off the ERT cart with a spray bottle, and watched as the doctor began talking to the old woman. Eventually, Jake escorted her to the curtain where her husband, or so I assumed, laid on his deathbed. I took a few steps back with Jake to let the woman grieve without being intruded upon. The nurse stepped out and waved me over to the cart for restocking of sterile equipment. I rolled the cart towards Jake, and we swapped ideas back and forth about what the hell had just happened. Jake said the old lady had called 911 after she found her husband bleeding. I asked him how he lost his finger, and he swears his hands were just fine. But the guy was bleeding from his eyes. That sent a chill down my spine. After a few more minutes, Jake bagged the body and wheeled him out towards the morgue. I was planning on going with him, but I realized the board they placed under the guy to defibrillate him was still in my room. I waited outside patiently when I noticed the doctor was still in the room talking to the old woman. Oddly enough, her tears were gone, and it barely looked like she'd been crying at all. That was when I noticed the doctor handing off a small bag to the woman. She delicately unzipped it and looked at the contents, and to my disbelief, it really was a finger. I took a step back in confusion. This is when the shit really hit the fan. The old lady stared straight through the small gap in the curtains, making eye contact with me, and just smiled. Not a friendly hello, or a subtle "I'm okay" smile, but a large grin, as if she was laughing about the whole ordeal. I started making my way back down the dark hallway when a strong hand gripped my shoulder. It was the doctor. In the dim light of the nearby elevator, I could just barely make out his name tag. Dr. Harrison looked me dead in the eyes through his thick glasses and told me not to mention this to anyone and not to record the crash cart use. It was freaky, but not the strangest thing that's ever happened here.
When I was 18, I got cosmetic surgery. Don't mock me. I was immature and made a lot of bad choices. I wanted big boobs. I went to the local hospital, Glyville Hospital. I met with the surgeon, Dr. Mertz, and picked out my size. I discussed prices. Fortunately, I had the money saved up, so that wasn't an issue. I was so excited to get my implants, and everything seemed to be falling into place. The day of my surgery didn't go too well. I got to the hospital and was prepped for surgery. As I was laying in a hospital bed, a fat black man with a deep southern accent walked into the room and began talking to me. He said his name was Michael Miracle. He explained how that just an hour ago, Dr. Mertz broke his arm and can't perform surgery with a broken arm. He said that he was an experienced cosmetic surgeon himself, so either he could perform the surgery himself, or I could cancel and find a new surgeon. I was a little impatient. Please keep in mind my age at the time, so I agreed to let the man perform my surgery. I was discharged from the hospital only an hour after my surgery. My boyfriend came to pick me up from the hospital. The ride home was pretty bad. I was in so much pain. The surgery went terribly. The next day I was in unbearable pain, and although I expected my boobs to be bruised and ugly, but they looked like they had gone through a meat grinder. I immediately went back to the hospital. They got me in right away. The nurse asked a few questions and told me the doctor would be with me in a few minutes. And within a few minutes, Dr. Mertz walked into the room, no cast or brace on his arm. I asked him about his arm and he was confused, not only at my surgery but at my implants. I told him Dr. Miracle was the person who performed the surgery and the person I thought I had an appointment scheduled with that day. Dr. Mertz calmly explained that he was the only cosmetic surgeon that works at the hospital. I claimed that could clearly not be true. Someone had to have performed my surgery. All surgeries are recorded on video. Dr. Mertz immediately had someone review the tapes to figure out who performed the surgery, and, indeed, Michael Miracle performed my surgery. Michael Miracle, a former lawyer being treated for mental illness at Glyville Hospital.
The hospital I work at is in a rural town I'm calling Shady Pines, since it's filled with snow-covered pine trees. And, from now on, I'll just call the hospital Shady General, since it's a pretty shady place in general. This place is so secluded, off in the woods, that most people don't even bother with cell phones, because the reception here is a joke, and the people here aren't too warm towards people who grow up elsewhere. The hospital has some friendly faces, since many people commute from about an hour outside, but those who were born and raised here would rather not see any of us, even if we are trying to save their lives. Shady Pines got settled in the late 1800s due to its promising timber, and within 10 years the place had a few thousand people in it. Young families arrived in droves to be part of a promising up-and-coming town. The excitement didn't last long. A diphtheria epidemic swept through the town, devastating most of the population. Sadly, young families lost many children. Most of the graves from the oldest parts of town are whole families. Parents in their early 20s, children just a few weeks old. When the plague finally began to subside, the town fell into financial collapse, and a deadly fire wiped out most of the rest of the town. There are tons of rumors about this place. Some say the place is a massive witching ground, and was godforsaken long ago. Others believe the devastation came as a result of a curse, that the very land these people settled was stolen from the Native American tribes who originally settled these lands. Whether any of this is true, I'm not sure. Some locals still believe in these superstitions today, discouraging exploration of some parts of town. But the truth was that the sickness hit vulnerable children and spread fast in such an isolated, tight-knit community. The town fell into financial collapse because the timber here was outdone by the burgeoning trade of other resources, such as copper. The fire even had an explanation too. Shady Pines was rich in trees, but not waterways. There was never an efficient way to transport the logs across the state without rivers, nor was drinking water readily available. So, when the first spark set the place ablaze, there was no hope of it being extinguished without rainfall. An act of God in this godless place. Despite all this tragedy, many of the original families stayed. By the 1920s, second and third generations of the town were beginning to prosper, and they never left. Shady General was built in the 1960s, when the population grew enough to warrant need for their own hospital. They also distrusted outsider doctors working on their children, especially when it came to the topic of vaccines, which leads us to the incident in question. Personally speaking, I've engrossed a solid portion of my life in the health field and understand many of the finer aspects of immunology. As you've probably guessed, I'm a huge supporter of vaccines. For whatever reason though, Shady Pines lives in the Dark Ages and does not, which results in a particularly curious rate of spinal meningitis among teens in the area. For those of you who don't know spinal meningitis, it's a particularly nasty infection. It's notorious for killing college students in dorms, and there are a handful of different types. Most typically, bacterial meningitis. Its prevalence does not detract from its lethality though. Within small, traditional-style schoolrooms, children spend their days in close proximity. One kid develops it, coughs, then the next kid gets it, and so on. It can cause headaches, nausea, vomiting, fever, sensitivity to light, confusion, and a slew of other symptoms. When the ordeal was beginning at Shady General, I was in my apartment playing video games, drinking and sleeping. Sarah, who also worked the same shift and who had been difficult to get along with initially, offered to work the long weekend for me in exchange for a few nights off during the week. I never had much going on, so I agreed, since I was still trying to win her over. She was also the only attractive female in the area, around my age, and I figured it may not hurt to try my luck at some point. I showed up on Monday night, like any other day, expecting a relatively mundane shift. I was very wrong. The entire intensive care unit was filled with over 24 teens, ranging from 14 to 17, suffering from severe meningeal infections. Naturally, none had been vaccinated against the disease. It was just me downstairs for the next 3 days, and the phone was ringing off the hook. Naturally, the elevator was under maintenance, so I spent my night running up and down 4 flights of stairs to intensive care, with bottles of saline, IV needles, syringes, and emesis basins, or, as normal people call them, puke buckets. The initial rush lasted roughly 3 hours, and eventually died down around 2:30 a.m. An hour later, I'd finished all my nightly duties and I was bored out of my mind. I decided to get up and try to go ahead on the morning shift's work, since this whole ordeal would inevitably start again when the patients finally woke up. I walked up the stairs slowly this time, carrying 2 handfuls of basins loaded with saline bottles. I hit the 4th floor, leaned my chest towards the badge reader, and pushed the door open with my hip. The elevators and stairwells lead into the central portions of the floors. To the left leads to the intensive care wing. To the right, progressive care. I moved towards ICU through the darkened halls. It was a bit odd, since normally at night the lights are dimmed, not shut off. People with meningitis can experience sensitivity to light, so I brushed it off as nothing. Until I got to the nurse station. The large round desk sat barren. Monitors to patient vitals were off. Computers were off, and there wasn't a single staff member in sight. I gently sat the supplies on the desk and began walking around the floor, looking for anyone I could find. Although I normally tried my best not to, I couldn't help but peer into the windows of the patients' rooms. Most rooms were too dark to make out much of anything. There wasn't a sound being made, which is unusual, because a hospital is the worst place to sleep between the roaming staff, vital checks, and beeping machines. I was genuinely weirded out. I walked around to the south end of the floor where the break room resided in PCU. Oddly enough, there was nobody there either. I started into the darkness, feeling around for a light switch. The lights flickered briefly before returning to black. I stared in disbelief until I heard a giggle behind me. The hair on my arm stood on end as I shot around to look behind me. Out of the corner of my eye, I could just barely make out the figure of a boy. This was bad. A kid with potential confusion and contagious illness roaming the halls unattended could be a disastrous liability issue. Clearly the nurses weren't around for whatever reason, so I ran after him. I tried to call out to him without yelling too loud. I chased, but noticed a small gleam of light emanating from the patient's room next to me. I turned my head slowly with a furrowed brow, because that's when an identical light showed into the hall through every room. I peered into the window to see a boy sitting straight up in bed, staring at the TV with his eyes closed. The television was nothing but static, and the kid was muttering something. As I made my way down the hall, looking into each patient room, it was the same story each time. Boys, girls, younger, older. All of them sat straight up, eyes closed, muttering at a static TV. I had to find that kid fast. Something bad was going on. I sprinted down the hall until I caught sight of him. He'd cut a corner to the room that dead ends near a small visitor lounge. I took a quick glance in the lounge, which was moonlit through the large window on the wall. He wasn't in any of the chairs, and, just to be sure, I opened the cupboards underneath the coffee machines on the counter. The delusional brat had to have run back to his room. It was strictly against regulation for me to deal with patients or go in rooms, especially when said patients are in isolation. I opened the small supply closet next to the doorway, grabbed a bright yellow precaution gown, and threw on a surgical mask. I stepped in, and to my surprise, the patient wasn't a young boy, but a roughly 17-year-old girl. I could barely see a thing in the room, but I tried to carefully navigate around her bed, dodging the trash can and IV pole to see where the kid was hiding. For whatever reason, the TV was still off, and she was lying down still. That's when the girl called to me. "Please make him go away. He keeps trying to make me watch," she whispered in an exasperated tone. I was caught off guard. "What do you mean? What room is he from?" I tried to say calmly to the girl. She pointed behind me and began muttering. The TV clicked on, and I nearly had a heart attack. I could barely make out what the girl was saying as she sat up, but she muttered the phrase, "We are his fingers." Whatever was happening, I got right out of there. I was calling security as I sped down the hall over and over, with no answer. That's when I heard the elevator. It had been shut down all day, but maybe someone from maintenance had just come up, or even a nurse. I rushed over to hear the sound of giggling once more. It was that damn kid. I couldn't let him beat me to another floor. By the time I hit the elevator lobby, it had just come back up. The door was open oddly, and the button to the basement was still lit. I spent most of my nights in the basement. It was home base for my department, but I couldn't help but feel apprehensive about heading down there. Long, unfinished halls littered with equipment, barren locker rooms, and the morgue was down there. I swallowed my fear and pressed the button with a shaky finger. The elevator seemed to drop forever. I could hear the beeps as we crossed every floor, but it beeped one extra time. I stared at the control panel in confusion as I saw the lit buttons go black. The doors opened to a black abyss. Only the eerie glow of a red exit sign illuminated the area at all. I could just barely make out dozens of intersecting pathways which cut through the hallway the elevator had led me to. I stepped into the darkness slowly. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't stop panting. Giggles echoed down some of the halls of whatever floor I was on now. I could just barely make out the decaying paint job of the walls and the much older doors which were not electronically locked. I read the panels as best I could. This was definitely an old surgical wing. I followed the laughter as it grew louder and louder down twisting halls which seemed to never end. I followed the labyrinth at a brisk pace until eventually the sound just stopped. I turned one last corner, and then I saw them. Standing in the hall in front of me was a dozen men and women. They all stared in my direction without moving a muscle or even making a sound. Their faces were marked with unsettling blank stares and large grins basking in the dim red glow of the exit signs, which seemed to mark every last hall. Each of them wore scrubs, and I was sure it was the intensive care nursing staff. I apprehensively called out, "Hello?" All at once, their catatonic stupor was over. Their heads shook violently as they paced towards me. I nearly pissed myself and made a run for it back the way I thought I came, the best I could. Forget the kid, forget the mystery floor, and most of all, forget these nurses. I ran for what felt like hours through the identical corridors until finally, by chance, I saw the dim light of the elevator in the distance. I sprinted to the doors, frantically pressing the buttons as I got inside. The nurses were approaching at a steady pace, without a sound. I pounded on the close elevator button until it finally shut. I clung to the back wall with my fists raised as I waited for the elevator to open once more. To my relief, it was just the basement. After running to the storeroom, and making sure the electronic lock closed the door tightly behind me, I frantically called security. Now this is where things get really weird. Nothing was out of the ordinary. Jake answered, happy as ever. He was on the 4th floor as we spoke. The power wasn't out, the patients were safe and sound, and the nursing staff was hard at work. I could even hear one nurse say thanks for the supplies in the background. I'm not sure if it was some sort of mass hysteria I witnessed. I know meningitis can cause hallucinations, but I don't think we all have it, and there are too many things that just can't be explained.